just curious before I get started, what year are you all?
We're both seniors.
Okay.
I'm a freshman.
Okay, alright, cool. So I'm Christine Gould. I am a clinical psychologist at the VA in Palo Alto and Stanford University. I have an appointment there, and I'll talk a little bit about what I do, the science side of it, as well as talking about my process of getting there. And ask me questions as we go. This is informal. Okay. So, clinical geropsychology, I talked a little bit about this in AP Psych, and so it's a specialty within clinical psychology that's focused on helping older adults and their families maintain well-being, overcome any problems, deal with mental health issues, and really help people achieve their maximum potential during later life. And it's a pretty new discipline. It was only recognized as a specialty in 1997. So that's pretty new in the whole scheme of things. So my process, so I'll kind of go through the timeline, but basically I started in high school volunteering a lot in nursing homes and things like that with Interact. Do you guys have an Interact club? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was, I think there's a lot more service organizations these days than there used to be. So worked with an Interact club, did a lot of volunteering. We did a project kind of potting plants around in the spring so that to kind of brighten people's rooms and also have some way for the high schoolers and the older adults to engage. Then I went to Middlebury College where I met Mr. Farina, and but along there I got a pretty good education. I really thought I wanted to be a doctor. I did all my pre-med requisites, did organic chemistry, and my favorite part of organic chemistry was the end of it, the applied part. Like the last lab, we distilled caffeine out of like some tea bags. The rest of it, all the benzene rings and all this and that, I just didn't really connect with. And I realized that, plus taking some other animal behavior courses and psychology courses, that I really was more interested in behavior and applications of things than the nitty-gritty ins and outs working of the body. I wanted to see the big picture. So at that point, that was about my junior year. I also took that spring, or that fall, I took a course by an adjunct professor. Do you know the term adjunct professor? So basically, when you go to college, there's all these professors that work at the university, and they teach the same courses over and over and over again. And an adjunct professor is maybe someone who comes from the outside who will teach one special course, and so it's not usually offered. And so this person, Julie Dumas, she was a cognitive psychologist, and she studied cognitive aging and taught a course on adulthood and development, or adulthood and aging. And she brought up this book, Aging with Grace, and she said it really was very interesting, and it's about this longitudinal nun study where this doctor decided to study aging. The best thing I should do is follow these nuns. So he wrote about it and studied who developed dementia and all these other things related to aging. So I took the course, I loved it. Then that spring, or that winter, J-term, I did a internship at a nursing home, and I did a lot of other volunteer work, and then decided to go more towards psychology rather than neuroscience. And then Julie Dumas, the interesting thing is, I went to my first conference as a postdoc, and she was there, and it was a conference of about 100 people, and now she and I actually run in very similar circles.
So why exactly, how do you make the decision between psychology and neuroscience?
Yes.
So versus more, maybe I don't know if cognitive science was really big back then.
That's a great question. So that gets a little into this. So it was sort of a blend. So cognitive psychology, so at the time when I was at school, the neuroscience department, all the experiments were on animals. Really basic animal behavior. One of our labs we did, we were doing research on animal behavior and doing, it was like eating behaviors, so we had to go in, do neurosurgery on these rats
Mhm.
and cut the fornix fibers and look at their eating behavior before and after. And so a lot of the faculty at that time were really focused just on the nitty-gritty basic biological processes and physiological psychology, and less on the outcome and neuroscience. There wasn't any people really doing cognitive neuroscience or cognition work. And then, except for this professor, Jason Arndt, who was in the psychology side of things. So Jason was a cognitive psychologist interested in memory. And so he was actually married to Julie, who taught that aging course. And so I took a research methods course with him and realized I was a total nerd and loved the research method sides of things, like learning how to answer questions really carefully. And I did an honors thesis with him. Since then, now Jason Arndt is the chair of the neuroscience department. So if I went to Middlebury today, I probably would be a neuroscience major. But since then, he kind of moved over, took over. He's the chair. He's doing great. But we did this experiment. And so at a small liberal arts school, there's benefits and drawbacks to all different schools. I think wherever you end up, you can make the best of it. But drawback of going to small liberal arts school, if you want to do any research, you're just going to basically be doing research on college students or animals or something like that, unless someone has a big lab. So Dr. Arndt and he did a lot of memory work, and I was interested in kind of how memories form and thinking about how we could apply it to aging. So we did this paradigm where we give people a list of words to learn. So if I were to give you a list of words, it would be redwood, maple, pine, elm. And then you learn it, and you learn a bunch of other words that are all related to one thing. But was there a word that those couple words related to, like what would that make you think of? Redwood, maple, elm, oak, pine.
Trees.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the lore, or the word that I'm not presenting, but that's kind of the false memory. So then when we test people, you give people all the words you showed them, so they get all those tree words plus tree. And then you manipulate how the conditions under which people learn to see what's related to responding and having a false memory. So with older adults, there are cognitive changes that happen. And so one thing that I read about back in 2004, 2003, was that if you speed up the time at which so normally you could just give people unlimited time to retrieve it, but if you give people, let's say, like 10 seconds to retrieve it, that will increase the rate of false memory, and that kind of mimics some retrieval problems that older adults have. So that was how I kind of tied in my interest in older adults to cognitive psychology. So we looked at a speeded retrieval paradigm. Can't believe I remember all that. But luckily, then Jason Arndt, one of the other nice things that I really enjoyed about doing research in college was working with the professor. I learned a lot from him. I presented a poster at a conference after I graduated, and then we wrote up my experiment, and then which was my honors thesis, and then an experiment he did in a paper that was my very first journal paper that was published. So it was pretty fun, and we learned a lot about the nitty-gritty. I learned a lot about how to design the methods, how to design experiments, we use some special software that kind of takes over a computer screen and shows people the words and tracks their response rate and their response time and things like that. So I did a lot of work with Excel as well as some ePrime software is what it was. So that was a long answer, but any other questions about college?
How long did you work in labs for? Like, when did you start?
I started pretty late. I took research methods my junior year and switched over my major my junior year and just did an honors thesis with Jason the next year. And so I came up with the idea over the summer, we emailed back and forth, refined it in the fall, wrote kind of the proposal, and then in the winter at Middlebury there's a 1-month J term where you take one course or do an internship, and I collected my data. We collected data, then in the spring I analyzed it. So just a little over a year. Looking back on it, I mean, I'm from New Jersey, and I wanted to get out of New Jersey, and Middlebury was like this gorgeous, great place that was totally different than New Jersey. And if I went to Rutgers University, where if you had like a pretty decent SAT score, they let most people in New Jersey go there for free. So I could have went to Rutgers for free. My parents might have been happy, but and I would have worked in a more traditional clinical psychology lab and probably went straight into grad school and had a different path. But I think wherever you end up taking whatever path that's there, and you figure out your way. Yeah. And then, yes. And then I worked, so then this was sort of the meandering off my path a little. I knew I wanted to do research. My parents wanted me to get a job. I wasn't ready to apply right to grad school. And I got a job offer from, and I hadn't ruled out medical school at this time, and I didn't know what clinical psychology really was. I had a professor who was also an adjunct who taught this course on clinical psychology, and the abnormal course I took wasn't that great. So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so took a job in Providence, Rhode Island as a clinical research assistant for 2 years. I ran clinical trials with kids with ADHD and sleep problems. I coordinated a pediatric sleep clinic on a Friday afternoon, which is the worst time ever to do clinics, because at the end of clinics and everything's busy and the hospital closes up and you're running around to try to help people figure out what's going on, and there's parents stressed out. But I learned a lot, and I worked with some clinical psychologists in that Friday afternoon pediatric sleep clinic who were teaching parents how to help their kids sleep better. And so there I learned more what clinical psychologists do, and I realized I don't really want to work with kids, even though I love kids, because you don't get to work with the kids, you have to work with the parents to fix the kids' behavior. So, and parents sometimes, it's hard to explain that to them because they just want to bring you their kid and say, fix him or her. So I applied for grad school, and there was actually an intern at Brown at our pediatric sleep clinic who did grad school at West Virginia University. And when I got an interview there, I told her who I was applying to work with, and she said, he's the nicest man ever, he's wonderful, you should work with him. So I went, I liked him a lot, I liked West Virginia, or I liked the idea of grad school. I was really nervous about going to West Virginia. It was a big jump. The first time I set foot in the state was when I went to interview. But I had a friend who was also a research assistant at Brown in a different lab, and she and I both interviewed there, both got in, and so that and she accepted her offer sooner than I did. I eventually accepted it and went there, and it was probably the second best decision I made, maybe the first best. But grad school, 5 years in Morgantown, West Virginia, got my Master of Science and PhD. And I learned a lot about stuff I had no idea existed. So psychology is such a huge field. I didn't know. And for people who are taking AP Psych now, you learn so much more than you learn in Psychology 101. It's kind of amazing. So I learned about radical behaviorism. Has anyone heard of behaviorism or B.F. Skinner?
Mm-hmm. You have, Monica.
Yeah, I have. I not in my head.
Okay. Not really? Okay. Well,
it's like the box, right? Or something.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
Skinner box, TG box. So, B.F. Skinner believed that people behave in a certain way because of conditioning. So not like the Pavlov's dogs and ringing a bell. So that's even, I forget how much I know sometimes. So he believed in rewards and punishment to increase or decrease behavior, and also in how the consequences affected your behavior. So for example, thinking of how you learned how to brush your teeth. Your parents probably nagged you when you didn't brush your teeth. Maybe they rewarded you when you did and gave you praise and things like that. Maybe if you didn't brush your teeth one night, they might have punished you, but that might be really rare. So B.F. Skinner would say the reason your brushing teeth behavior, the frequency of doing that, increased might have been because of positive reinforcement, so praise, rewards, but also to get away from the nagging. So you increased your brushing teeth behavior, so you did it on more nights because then your mom, dad, whoever wouldn't be nagging you. You just do it and then they don't come bother you and you have your time to yourself. So he really thought that people's behavior wasn't biologically driven as much as really driven by your environment and how you interact with your environment. And radical behaviorism and he didn't believe in really thoughts much at all. Radical behaviorism took it a step further, and he thought the brain was just this black box that we can't really learn anything from. We just know what people do. Radical behaviorism takes it a little bit more concretely, and they say, well, we can talk about thoughts, they're just verbal behavior. I can't hear your thoughts. I don't know what Mr. Farina is thinking right now, but I think he's probably looking at cat videos. But if I were to ask you, Chris, what were you just thinking about?
I was thinking about how crazy the whole House Intelligence Chair story is and the crazy stuff that's going on about investigations.
And how does that make you feel?
Frustrated.
Yeah, so what I can get at what's going on in his head is what he's saying and his feelings, his self-report of it. But then if we hooked him up to monitor or something like that, we might be able to monitor his skin conductance, his heart rate, things like his rate of respiration to sort of get at what is going on inside. So basically, behaviorism is saying we can only fix and target what we see or observe in some way. So we did this I took this course at 8:30 a.m. every day, which is early for grad student, our second year, where we literally put pigeons in these boxes. So like the traditional, are these Skinner boxes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in the Skinner boxes where they peck a key and we change their rate of reinforcement and they'd have printouts of the rate of their behavior, and really interesting and nothing I thought I would have ever done. But I learned a lot from it. I did clinical training in cognitive behavioral therapy. I worked at a state hospital where they had older adults with psychiatric disorders, so I learned a lot about abnormal behavior, difficult behaviors. I did some late life anxiety research. That was sort of grad school in a nutshell. How am I on time? When are we done?
10 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe you should take like a quick second and
Yeah.
just talk, because like if you're studying CBT, right, that has a cognitive aspect that pure radical behaviorism doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reconcile that aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy with the idea that like you don't know what I'm thinking according to a radical behaviorist, right?
Well, radical behaviorists would say that I know your verbal behavior, so therefore we can talk about what you're thinking.
So then do you really care about like the cognitive side of CBT, or do you mostly focus on the behavioral side of CBT?
So that's a good question. So let's talk about that in terms of anxiety. So we have some concrete examples. So one thing I study is anxiety. So what are some symptoms of anxiety? Think of how you feel before a test.
I shouldn't know this. I just took the
increased
test
heart
on
rate.
anxiety.
Increased heart rate, yeah.
Yeah.
Start sweating.
Sweating.
I really should know this. I took the test this morning.
What thoughts do you have?
Oh,
Nervousness.
nervous.
Negative thoughts.
Negative
like
thoughts.
the worst thing that could possibly happen.
Exactly. Catastrophic thinking, the worst thing that could happen.
Do you have like a broad array of open-ended thoughts, or does your mind kind of shut down sometimes?
sometimes shut down a little bit.
Like trying to think about how you feel when you're anxious.
Do you ever avoid studying because you're so nervous and you'd rather do something else?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the avoidance behavior is something we could observe. The heart rate, we could observe it from a monitor. The thoughts are something that you'd have to tell me. I could kind of look at your faces, or you could look at my face and you could say, looks like they're thinking, and you could sort of make a judgment of how they're feeling, but you don't, maybe if I were really worried, my brows might be furrowed or things like that. So what Mr. Farina or Chris was saying was like, how do I reconcile that with cognitive behavioral therapy? So cognitive behavioral therapy tries to teach people ways to improve their thinking and their behavior. So with Pen, as a behaviorist, how do I talk about thoughts? So we spend so much time in our minds and we spend so much time thinking. I don't think you can fully ignore thoughts. So if someone were worrying, for example, saying, I'm having trouble thinking about something else, I might teach them relaxation and strategies to distract from the worrying, or strategies to figure out how to gain more control over it. Say setting a worry time. You worry for 10 minutes a day at 10 a.m. or something in a certain chair, and after that you just tell yourself, I'll worry about it later, because that's kind of breaking that mental habit of worrying. For avoidance, we do hierarchies where we kind of do encourage people to engage in the behaviors that they're avoiding. So I can conceptualize things as behaviors, and for me, anything someone says is a behavior, and so I'm not too on the radical side of behaviorism. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So that kind of gets at that. And so what I study is really anxiety. So the reason I study it is because anxiety disorders affect 1 in 5 individuals. But as you look at older adults, the prevalence will decline. However, everyone thinks of older adults as being depressed. Even all the researchers study depression in late life. And depression's really bad. There's a lot of terrible outcomes, including suicide, functional impairment. People might get hospitalized or be in long-term care and not be able to care for themselves if they're depressed and they have medical conditions. But oftentimes anxiety will precede or come first and develop before depression. And anxiety is also twice as common as depression, and anxiety causes a lot of avoidance. So you can imagine if you're kind of nervous about going outside and you're older, or develop a fear of falling, that could be really detrimental, and then depression could follow. So if you stop going outside, stop engaging in pleasant activities, then your mood might drop, you become depressed, and it kind of snowballs. So that's sort of why I study it. Then I came here for a clinical psychology internship, which is a 1-year clinical year, a fellowship, and then I got licensed as a psychologist, which is it's a computerized multiple choice exam, and there's one for nationally and one for the state of California. Any questions about general psychology? Mm-hmm.
For things like eating disorders, would like working out help that? Like, say someone has like, I don't know, like bulimia, like would telling them to like run or something like help them, or is that like counterproductive?
It would depend on the function of the running. So if they're running in a healthy way, that could help, but if they're running after they binge as a purging strategy, that could be tricky.
Okay.
So a lot of that kind of gets back to behaviorism and knowing about why someone's doing it. So with bulimia, it's tricky because you have people who eat a lot and then will purge, or you could have people or they could purge by over-exercising. So if you were using it as a way to just kind of maintain healthy and say, when you have this urge to eat a lot, why don't you go for a walk and do kind of lighter exercise, as long as it's not overexertion to reduce the calories or to control it.
But like, how would you know? Because whether or not the stress relief coming was because they were burning calories or because of like the endorphins that come from running, or like how?
That's a good question. You might not know that unless you did kind of biological studies and looked at it, but the way we try to estimate that is by doing self-monitoring. So you'd have someone keep track of how they feel, keep track of what their mood is, or what maybe their urges to binge would be something that you keep track with eating disorders. So you keep track of the urges to binge and also keep track of exercise, and you'd end up kind of graphing the two out. And so let's say this, let's say if that was your urge to binge, and if that's your, if this was when you like exercise these times, that might be, you'd say that's not correlated. But if someone's urge to binge and their exercise is straight, they reflect each other, then you might say, talk to the person. How were you feeling when you did that? How did you feel afterwards? And just try to work through it that way. Yeah. Psychology's fun. It's more complicated than it looks on the surface. But so that's sort of in a nutshell what I do. And I can always, if people have